Well, we are extremely delighted to have Professor Jane Risen with us today as one of our keynote speakers. Professor Risen has a PhD in social and personality psychology and is a professor of behavioral science at Booth. She has received many accolades, including being elected a fellow for the Association of Psychological Science. She studies a range of really interesting topics, many of which think about the interplay between reason and intuition. So one reason I'm so excited for her talk is that I think the topics she studied have a lot of intersections with the types of issues that economists think about, and I think implications for the way that economists might want to think about those issues. On a more personal note, I have the privilege of having Jane as a colleague. I find talking to her fascinating, and she's giving me some really useful and helpful feedback on my own work. So one of the many topics Jane works on is magical thinking, which I believe is the topic of her talk today. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us today, Jane, and I'll hand it over to you.
So I really appreciate being invited, especially because, as Rebecca said, I'm not an economist, I'm a social psychologist. And so having the chance to share my interests and some of my research with a neighboring discipline, I think, provides really nice opportunities for forging connections. In this work, I'm interested in understanding why people hold superstitions, so why we believe things that aren't true, but also why we believe things that we know aren't true. And so I try to identify psychological processes that produce our intuitive beliefs so that we can better understand how people use their intuitions, and in particular, when they come into conflict with the output of a more rational or deliberate thought process. And I've always found that the topic of superstition and magical thinking provides a really nice place to explore how people resolve conflict between intuitive beliefs and their more rational knowledge. Because when it comes to superstitious beliefs, many people will tell you that they're sort of two minds. So even people who claim not to be superstitious will still show signs of superstition. Let me start with a couple of quotes to give you a sense of what I am focused on here. So sports fans are always very helpful in providing fodder. So here, this first one, this fan says, "I'm not superstitious, but I'm a Jays jinx. I turned on the radio yesterday just to catch the score. Just as they said the score, the other team scored, so I switched right away. Later, just flipping through the TV channels, bang, the Rangers got another run. So relax, Jays fans. I will not listen or watch any games. They are perfect if I stay away." And just to be clear, not superstitious. Here's another similar quote in terms of fearing what happens if you watch. And so here in hockey, "Reese, don't be an idiot. This isn't quantum physics and you don't have cosmic jinxing powers. You can watch Calgary, LA, but why take that chance?" And just to make it clear that it's not just sports fans who are doing this, I like this anecdote about two scientists having a conversation. The friend kept glancing at a horseshoe hanging over the door. Finally, unable to contain his curiosity any longer, he demanded, "Niels, it can't possibly be that you, a brilliant scientist, believe that foolish horseshoe superstition?" "Of course not," replied the scientist, "but I understand it's lucky whether you believe in it or not." And this story is not just an ordinary scientist, it's told of Nobel Prize winner Niels Bohr. And so I think this nicely captures the phenomenon that I'm interested in. What are the psychological processes that lead even the most intelligent people to hold beliefs that are not true and to hold beliefs that they themselves know can't be true? So I'll back up for a moment and just think about some of the accounts that have been offered in the literature for magical thinking and superstition. And the first one is really focused on sort of cognitive shortcomings. And this started in the anthropology literature, but then sort of was also borrowed into psychology as well. And the idea here is that the reason you see these superstitions or this poor reasoning is because some people, whether it's due to culture, from some scholars, or age, or even just the stress in the moment, they don't have the capacity. They're too primitive to reason properly. But of course, superstitions are not limited to individuals with cognitive shortcomings, right? Smart, educated adults have superstitions that are not rational. More than half of surveyed Americans, for example, say that they knock on wood. Almost a quarter of them avoid walking under ladders. And so another account, a more motivational account that's been offered in the literature is the idea that superstitions and magical thinking are designed to help us manage uncertainty, that it's uncomfortable, unpleasant when we're experiencing that, and it can help reduce the tension that's associated with it. And indeed, there is good research to show that you'll see more magical thinking in times of economic strife, in times when people are sort of physically more in danger, and even if you just randomly assign to them to think about times when they've had control or not had control. But despite what we might have learned from these accounts, I think there's still a lot that is not explained here. And so why do ordinary people show signs of magical thinking in fairly ordinary circumstances? In addition, why do they form the particular superstitious beliefs that they do? So coming from a social psych JDM kind of background, it may not be too surprising to you to know that I think of this, and I think we can help understand some of this behavior by thinking about it through a dual process or two systems kind of a model. And I wrote a paper a few years back designed to apply a dual process model to superstition and magical thinking. And I'm going to use that paper really to sort of set up today's talk. So the first goal in the paper was to apply a basic model to the literature. And then the second goal was to recognize evidence that in the literature that may not be accounted by that basic dual process model, and to think about how we might want to refine and advance that model so that it can accommodate some of the findings from superstition closer to someone like the Niels Bohr case. And so using that for today's talk, my plan is to start by focusing on the basic dual process model, and then spend the second part of the talk thinking about how we can modify it to help explain some things that we might not get to with the basic model. And so I'll introduce the basic model and some of the predictions that I think come from it. I'll plan to describe just a few studies from earlier work that is consistent with that model. And then in the second part of the talk, I will introduce the new models, talk about the modifications, and then describe what I think we need to use as criterion if we want to say that there is such thing, that it's possible for people to maintain a belief, maintain an intuition that they know is wrong. What are the criteria we need? And then I will describe a few studies that are going to test for those criteria. So let me jump into the basic model. This is of the flavor of a corrective model. So this would be something that would align well with something like a Kahneman and Frederick's model. The idea here is that system one, the set of mental processes that we have that operate very quickly and efficiently, will automatically activate an intuition. And that system one intuition will guide behavior to the extent that system two are the set of mental processes that operate in a more slow and deliberate manner, if system two does not become engaged. So if you have an intuition and system two doesn't become engaged, then the intuition will drive your judgment and behavior. But if system two does become engaged, then it has the opportunity to override and correct an intuition that's been identified as faulty. And so you may have thought about this in terms of something like the CRT. So this is, I think, one of the most common questions on the CRT. A bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? And the idea here is that when you read that, I won't speak for this audience, but generally speaking, the first thing that jumps to people's minds is 10 cents. And so with this model, the idea is that if people answer 10 cents, it suggests that system two didn't get involved, that everybody could figure out that that's wrong, but they don't. In contrast, when people give you the right answer of 5 cents, the assumption is that system two became engaged to help process that. And so with this in mind, for the first part of the talk, all I'm going to do is put in the word magical. So I didn't change anything else. All I'm going to do is say that this applies to magical thoughts too. And so to the extent that a magical intuition is activated, it will guide judgment and behavior if it flies under the radar of system two. But if system two gets engaged, then it can override or correct that magical intuition. And part of what I like about applying this model is I think that we can accommodate those traditional accounts that I mentioned before. So in terms of thinking about when is a magical intuition likely to be activated, well, surely your motivation to manage uncertainty in the moment will contribute to whether an intuition is activated. If you are watching a sporting event live, for example, the more superstitions may be coming to mind than if you're watching it on tape delay. Secondly, when we think about something like cognitive skills, this may help us think about when system 2 and for who system 2 is likely to become engaged. And beyond accommodating these two accounts, though, we can think of other predictions that a dual process model would make. And so here are some predictions that I think emerge from this model. So if system 1 processing is common to all people, then we should see magical intuitions that are widespread, not restricted to certain populations or ages or anything like that. Because system 1 produces systematic errors, often as a reliance on particular heuristics, then we would expect that our magical intuitions are going to develop tied to some of those heuristics. So something like representativeness or availability. And so, for example, something like voodoo is a nice example of a superstition or a magical thinking that is very much relying on similarity or representativeness. Magical intuitions should be able to occur under conditions of automaticity if it's based on system 1 processing. So they should be able to occur even when people don't have the intent or awareness or the cognitive resources to engage. And finally, and most straightforwardly, that judgment and behavior should be less likely to rely on magical intuitions when system 2 is engaged and more so when it's not. And my reading of the literature is that there is support for all of these, though some of these have been tested, I think, more than others. And I just want to be clear, I'm not suggesting that all of these references are actually testing the dual process account or even testing the specific prediction. Instead, what I'm listing out references where I see things that are consistent with those predictions. And what I thought I would do here at the first part of the talk is to just describe a few of my studies that are also consistent with some of these predictions. And so this is, there are lots of other papers that I could highlight, but you invited me, so I'm going to tell you about some of mine. And in particular, I'll tell you about 2 studies that came from my dissertation work on people's belief in tempting fate, which is intended to show you that this magical belief builds on the availability heuristic. And also some support to show that it can occur automatically. And then I'll share one study with you from a different paper to think about how this is not limited to certain populations, but that even in sort of very educated samples, we're still going to see behavior that lines up with these superstitious intuitions. So the belief in tempting fate reflects the idea that negative outcomes are especially likely to occur following certain behaviors. For example, our participants will tell us that it's more likely to rain when Julie doesn't bring her umbrella than when she does. They think John's less likely to be accepted to Stanford if he wears a Stanford t-shirt while he's waiting to hear than if he stuffs that shirt in a drawer. Students report that they're more likely to be called on at random by a professor if they haven't done the reading for class than if they have. And in this work, we suggest that this intuition that it's bad luck to tempt fate arises from a combination of 2 well-documented automatic processes. The first is negativity bias, so the tendency for negative prospects to capture your attention. And the second, the availability heuristic. So that's the tendency to use the ease with something comes to mind as a cue for judging its likelihood. And so what I want to do is describe some studies that suggest that this belief is building on these negative outcomes jumping to mind, that it is this system 1 processing of this heuristic. And so in this study here, we have people read several stories. They read 12 different stories on the computer in a random order. They can take as much time as they need to read the story. But then when they advance to the next slide, they see just a 1-sentence ending. And here, as fast as possible, they have to answer whether that ending is a logical ending to the story that they read, or it's a complete non sequitur. The character changed, the plot changed, everything about it changed. And for the 2 critical stories for this study, we're going to use getting called on in class and then getting into Stanford stories. And participants read either a version where there is a behavior that tempted fate, so presumptuously wearing your t-shirt or not preparing for class, or the other version where fate was not tempted. And then they're always, and for these stories, they're always going to be shown a logical negative ending. After several moments of silence, the professor calls on you. A month later, John receives a rejection letter from Stanford. So the answer is yes, this is logical. We should see everybody saying yes. The question is, how long does it take them to do that? And the idea here is that if the story itself is bringing negative outcomes to mind, then they'll be faster to recognize that negative outcome as one that makes sense. And so what I'll show you here is the speed to say that the negative ending makes sense, with lower scores meaning faster. It took less time. And for both of these stories, we find that participants are faster to recognize that negative ending as a logical ending when they were reading about a behavior where fate had been tempted. To make sure that it's not any outcome that comes to mind, but only the negative ones, we also ran versions where they would see like a positive ending in the Stanford story, that he was accepted. In fact, if they read the version where John was thought to tempt fate, people were slower to recognize that positive ending. And we also find that their speed, their reaction times in these studies statistically mediate likelihood judgment. So it suggests that their beliefs about what is likely to happen are being driven, at least in part, by the ease with which these endings are coming to mind, these outcomes are coming to mind. In terms of some evidence for the automaticity of this, what we did was we had half of participants read the story about getting called on in class in regular conditions. So they just read a story and told us how likely they think it is that they would be called on. And we replicated previous versions where people were more likely to believe they'd get called on if they hadn't done the reading. But then for half of participants, we taxed their working memory while they were in the process of reading and answering. And so this cognitive load meant that they were counting backwards by threes from a really high number while simultaneously engaging with the story. Now, if cognitive resources are required for this belief to emerge, then you think that with cognitive load, you might not see an effect. But what we predict is that the belief does not require cognitive resources. Rather, correcting this error, that's what's going to require cognitive resources. And indeed, we find a stronger effect, a bigger effect size, when people were put under cognitive load, which suggests that the effect is strongest when effortful processing is interfered with. Now, I know that I've just shared a study on reaction times and one on likelihood judgments, and I'm talking to economists, so I better include some behavior. This next one has at least one behavioral DV here. This is going to build on people's intuition about exchanging lottery tickets. And so what's funny about this behavior is people are not overly optimistic that their ticket will win when they have it. So they don't report that they're more likely to win than other tickets. But if you ask them to imagine exchanging it, then they think that ticket will win, right? The negative outcome of it winning in someone else's hands comes to mind, and people think it's more likely to happen. And so we wanted to explore this and see whether it affects behavior. And so in this study, we assigned participants to a partner who was actually a confederate, and that confederate helps us randomly assign them to their conditions. The pair of them are given some numbers that are their winning numbers and other numbers that are their losing numbers. And then the partner, the confederate, decides whether they want to keep the numbers that they were given or flip them so that the winners become the losers and the losers become the winners. Then the participant is going to tell us how optimistic or pessimistic they are about winning the lottery. And they're also given a chance to make a decision for the pair, which is whether they want to buy insurance for the lottery. And the insurance is not a good value based on the expected value of the lottery and the insurance that we're offering. And what we find is that when it comes to optimism, indeed, participants who have had their numbers switched, they have the losing numbers now, they think they're less likely to win compared to those who have their original numbers. And it also translates into whether or how much both they want to purchase insurance. And so it seems to be that this pessimism is real, such that they are willing to pay more to protect themselves from this lottery. So these few studies are some of my own work that is meant to highlight the fact that there's evidence that is consistent with this kind of basic dual process model. And more broadly, what I'm trying to suggest is that this can help us understand why magical thinking is widespread, why particular beliefs that rely on certain heuristics are particularly likely to arise, and why they are maintained even though they're not true. But it doesn't quite explain some of those early quotes and examples that I gave you, and so that's what we want to think about next. To understand why superstitious beliefs are maintained even when people know they're not true, it requires that that model be refined. And so an unstated assumption of the model I showed before is that if an error is detected, it will be corrected. And I think that's a pretty reasonable assumption in lots of situations. But what we find in the magical thinking literature is that there are demonstrations where people sometimes recognize in the moment that their intuition does not make any sense rationally, and they follow it anyway. And so people seem to be detecting an error, but not correcting it, choosing not to correct. And I'm going to refer to this process as acquiescence. So we go back to this model that I showed before, and all I want to do is decouple detection and correction. And so by adding that extra layer, what it allows us to do is to think about this case, where system 2 can detect an error, but not correct the error. And that's what I'm going to refer to as acquiescence. That I know this is not rational, but I'm going to continue to believe it. And so I think that this helps us understand this simultaneous belief and non-belief, right? Knowing that the intuition is an error, but letting it stand. So thinking about the predictions from this model, this slightly modified one, the first is just the basic, the existence of acquiescence, that people can stick with their intuition even when they have identified it as irrational. And indeed, the model was developed to accommodate this, this idea. Another prediction that I think is important, and I won't spend as much time on it, but this may be where it's more useful in terms of connecting to other people's work, is the idea that detection and correction can be measured separately. And also when we think about interventions, that you would want to think about that for what is going to be most effective. So for any error that we see in belief or behavior, can we identify whether it's a failure to detect the error or a failure to correct the error? And knowing which of those may help us find interventions that are more likely to target the particular problem that people are having. I also think that this just sets up some questions as well, not direct predictions, but it makes you think, well, what factors make acquiescence more likely, and what's the subjective experience of acquiescence like? And so I think that this emerges from this model, though the red one is where I'm going to focus my time today, is just trying to convince you that this happens, that people can simultaneously believe and not believe. And so for the rest of the talk, what I'm going to try to do is offer you two examples in the literature that I always sort of took to be examples of acquiescence, but without formally testing it, it's unclear. And so we're going to push a little bit on that to say, is it really acquiescence? What would we need to know? What would we need to see to be sure? And so that's why I will introduce some criteria for thinking about what would allow us to say that this is definitely an example of acquiescence. And then I'll share a few studies that were designed to test these criteria. The first example is one of my favorite studies. This was done by Paul Rosen and his colleagues. And so they have participants come to the lab, and there's a bag of sugar and two bowls. The sugar goes into the two bowls, and then participants get to put a label. One label that says poison, sodium cyanide, another one says sugar or sucrose, and they just decide which label they put on which bowl. But then they have to use sugar from one of those bowls in their juice. And what you find is that people do not want to use the sugar from a bowl that's labeled poison, even though they put the label on and they knew it came from the same bag of sugar. And the authors describe this in their paper. They say they realized that their negative feelings were unfounded, but they felt and acknowledged them anyway. So this, of course, this is an example that I would consider magical thinking. The next example I want to give you, the ratio bias, is not magical thinking. I'm not considering this magical thinking, but it's a common intuitive error that I think may be due to acquiescence as well. And I want to make the pitch that the idea of acquiescence is not restricted to superstition. That's a place where we see it and why I kind of came to this, but I also think it applies to other domains as well. So you may be familiar with the ratio bias. This is a case where people are presented with two bowls to draw marbles out of. And if they draw a red marble, for example, in this case, they would win money. And it's actually made much easier than this. You don't have to just look at it like this. You get to know exactly what's inside. So you can see that tray A has 9 red marbles, but a 9% chance of winning, whereas tray B has 1 winning red marble and a 10% chance of winning. And even though this information is presented to people, many people will choose the worst bowl, but the one with more marbles and more winners. In fact, in studies that give sort of repeated trials of number of winners conflicting with percentage chance to win, you'll find that something like 80% of people will choose the wrong bowl at least once. And so both of those have always felt to me like examples of acquiescence, where people know in the moment that they're doing something that doesn't make any sense. But we can push on that a little bit because it's possible that something else is going on. So acquiescence requires that people have a faulty intuition. And when you only measure behavior, like those 2 studies I showed you, it's unclear whether that's the case. Do they have the intuition that it would be bad to use the sugar? Would something happen? Would something bad happen? Is that what they're expecting? Do they have the intuition that they'd be more likely to win from the big bowl? Or maybe the behavior is being driven by something else. Maybe it's not the faulty intuition that is driving things. In addition, acquiescence requires that people recognize that their intuition is wrong in the moment. Now, it seems like that should be the case, but is it? Do they know that it's irrational to care about the label that they put on? Do they know that it's irrational to draw from the big bowl if their goal is to win? And so maybe they're just not detecting the error. And so with this in mind, I want to think about what criteria we would need. And so the first is evidence for that faulty intuition, that the individual has a faulty intuition that something is more or less likely to happen given a certain behavior or state of the world. And for me, I think that this really requires a dependent variable that maps onto expectations about what's going to happen, some sort of judgment about how the world is going to unfold. The second criteria is that the person is aware that the intuition is rational. And so maybe just as simple as asking them in this situation, what is the rational response, and making sure that they do actually know. The third is that people will follow, they'll stick with that faulty intuition even while knowing that it's irrational. And so one thing to note with this is it means that we're going to want to make sure that we select on people who detect the error. So normally we think about selecting as being a problem, but here it's going to be the more appropriate and more conservative test to focus specifically on the people that do identify something that's irrational. And the other thing is that because it's hard to know what the right comparison is with some of these criteria, what we're going to want to do is compare whether people are more likely to ignore what's rational and follow an intuition in conditions where we have set up a competing faulty intuition compared to cases where there is no intuition to follow. I think that'll be more clear in a moment when I get to the studies. And finally, I hope this appeals to people, is that the first 3 criteria, if they were supported, it would provide some evidence for acquiescence, but it could still just be kind of a tiebreaker. And so in all of the studies, we're going to try to put some cost to ignoring the rational option. And so if you think of those earlier examples, the ratio bias would count because there's an expected loss there, whereas the sugar one would not because there's no cost to using sugar from one bowl or the other. And so the first study that I'll share with you is the ratio bias study, because as I said, this was one that I had always thought was likely to be an example of acquiescence. And so we ran this on mTurk, and participants in the intuition present condition saw something similar to what I showed you before. They also saw the images. It wasn't just this, but this is going to make things, just showing you the table will make it easy to see how these differ. But you can see that tray A has more winning marbles, but tray B gives you a better chance of winning. In the intuition absent condition, tray B is exactly the same, and tray A has been changed so that the rational, the normative part of it stays the same, but this intuition that it's easier to win when there are more winners has been pulled out because there's only one red winning marble in that case too. And so tray B always has better odds. Tray A has more winning marbles, which creates that intuition that's faulty in the intuition present condition, but not in the intuition absent condition. We're going to look at their choices, their behavior, of course, but we also need to test for criteria 1 and 2, which will do counterbalancing these questions and do that before they are asked the actual behavior that they want to do. And so the first criteria, based only on your gut feeling or your intuition, which tray feels like the one from which you are more likely to draw a red winner? And we do see a strong difference between these conditions, with people being more likely to report the incorrect answer of tray A being the winner when there are 10 winners in that bowl compared to the intuition absent condition. So we see evidence for a faulty intuition, but it's worth noting that this isn't overwhelming. It's still less than half of our participants who are endorsing this faulty intuition in this case. We also ask them, based only on reason or rational analysis, which tray should you choose if you want to draw a red winner? Here, people do quite well. They know that they should follow the percentages. Not everybody, but most people. And so then when we look at their choices, when we look at everybody, we see that there is a difference across conditions, with people being more likely to choose tray A when the faulty intuition was sort of created in that condition. But as I mentioned, we need to pull out those people who aren't getting that rationality question right. So even though most people got it right here, there were some who got it wrong. And in fact, when we pull that out, you'll see that that difference, the statistical significance is no longer there. And so thinking to the criterion, although we have support for 1 and 2, in this study, we don't have support for that third criteria, right? People are following an intuition that most people know is irrational, but we can't say that the people who are following the intuition recognize it's irrational when they do so. If we doubled our sample, or if we ran it live so that they could actually see them, I think it's very possible that we would have evidence for it. But from this study, I cannot claim evidence for acquiescence. So we moved to a second study, and with the goal of finding a faulty intuition that we thought would be maybe more widespread, and also one that might feel a little bit more powerful, that would be harder to sort of ignore. And so here we're going to build on this intuition that it's bad luck to exchange a lottery ticket. We have people come to the lab, and there's 3 pieces of paper numbered 1, 2, and 3 in front of them, and they're given 3 envelopes. So they can shuffle them and put them out in any way they want, so that they know it's them and it's not being sort of created by the experimenter where everything goes. They're told that one of the 3 envelopes has $5 in it and that the other 2 are empty. In the intuition present condition, we're going to ask people to guess which envelope has the money, and then they write their name on that envelope. And then they're offered the choice. You can keep that original envelope, or you can trade it for both of the other 2 envelopes. And I just want to pause here to make this clear. This is not supposed to be tricky. This is not Monty Hall. This is, do you want 1 envelope or do you want 2 envelopes? The intuition absent condition, like in the earlier study, is designed to be identical in terms of the rational aspects of it, but we want to pull out this fear of exchanging. And so here, participants are offered the choice of 1 envelope or 2 randomly determined for each person. So they're looking at their desk, and the experimenter, based on wherever their table tells them, would say, do you want envelope 1 or envelopes 2 and 3? Do you want envelope 2 or envelopes 1 and 3? And so again, rationally, they're matched. You're more likely to win with 2 envelopes in both cases. But the intuition that it's bad luck to trade or exchange a ticket is only present, only conflicts with what's rational in that first case. Again, we're going to test these first 2 criteria before we look at behavior. So based on your gut feeling, where do you feel the money is most likely to be located? And we see, again, differences across the conditions. And here we see a little bit of a higher rate compared to last time. The majority of people are reporting the faulty intuition that they would be more likely to win with their original envelope in that intuition present condition. We also ask, based on rational analysis, with which envelope are you most likely to win? This was a little disheartening. The majority of people are getting it right, but not everybody. In a follow-up studies, we have added a sentence where it says something, where it says, Of course, with 2 envelopes, you're twice as likely to win as with 1. When we say that, then these numbers shoot up much closer to 100%. When we ran this first study, we thought that people would get there on their own. It turns out they need a little bit more hand-holding to recognize what's rational here. The third criteria is, what do they do? What's their behavior? Are they going to choose that single envelope? We do see a significant difference across conditions with everybody. And then even when we filter and only select on people who get that rationality question right, which is particularly important in this case because there was more errors here, we still see a significant difference. So it's still the case that people are more likely to choose 1 envelope than 2 in that intuition present condition, even though they tell you that 2 makes it more likely to win. And so unlike the first study, I think we have support for all 3 criteria in this study. And I mentioned the follow-up study that helps with that answer to rational. Another thing we did in that follow-up study was either had people do everything as if it was them, that they were the person playing this. We also had them do it and provide advice, what you would tell someone else, this guy John, to do. And we see all 3 criteria met in either of those cases. And I think this is useful because it tells us that it's not just that we're picking up on sort of emotion or, you know, an anticipatory regret story, because people also tell you that John is more likely to lose when he trades it in. And so it seems to be more about how the world operates, their belief about how the world is operating. The next study is going to rely on blackjack. And you'll see here the hand that I'm showing you is that you have a 13 and you're facing a dealer with a 4. And you can think to yourself whether you want to hit or stand. In pre-testing, we have found that people think that they should hit. As it turns out, you should not, you should stand. And so why does this emerge? I suspect that it has to do with some sort of with egocentrism. I'm focused on my own hand. 13 just doesn't seem good enough. Not enough focus on what the dealer's situation is with that 4 showing. But we're going to use this hand to exploit, again, a conflict between a faulty intuition and rational knowledge. And so here, in the first round of the study, participants are just going to provide their intuitive judgments for how likely they think they are to win if they hit, and how likely they think they are to win if they stand, for several different blackjack hands. Then in the second round, they're going to play an incentivized game of blackjack. And for each hand, before they decide what to do, they have to look at a blackjack strategy table and click and indicate what the table tells them that they should do. And then they get to decide what they're going to do. And we're going to compare responses for an intuition present hand, where there's a conflict between intuition and reason, and another hand that's matched, but there is no faulty intuition. And so this is going to be a within subject study, because everybody is going to be exposed to both of these blackjack hands, and we'll be able to see how they behave. So first, I should note that the strategy table that we provide and that we use only has hit and stand. We're not going to include splits and double downs and things of that sort. And so these are our 2 hands, and we match them because the objective likelihood of winning is 3% better if you stand than if you hit for both of these hands. But from pre-testing, we know that there is a conflicting faulty intuition when people have a 13 facing a 4, where they think that they should hit. Instead, here, people in our pre-test showed the correct intuition that they should stand when they're facing the soft 18. And so criteria 1 is set up in round 1, where we ask people how likely they are to win if they stand or if they hit. And for the intuition present hand, we replicate this faulty intuition we saw in the pretest, that people think that they should hit, even though we know that's not true. The intuition absent hand shows that people are correct in recognizing that they should stand. Now, before they get to actually play, in round 2, I mentioned that they're going to see the blackjack strategy table. And so when they do that, they have to click on the table that corresponds, and then they're going to respond to the question, based only on reason or rational analysis, what should you do if you want to maximize your chance of winning this hand? And then they play out on the next page and get paid. And so here we are seeing people doing a good job of recognizing that the rational thing to do is to follow the table. And then the question is, what do they actually do? And so we find with everybody together that indeed more people are hitting on that 13, just even though they just acknowledge that they should, that the rational thing to do is to stand. And even when we filter out some of those people, all the people who didn't answer the rationality question right, we still see a strong difference across these two conditions. And there's something very nice, I think, about the within subject nature of this, because if you think it's just, well, people, it's not fun to always follow the table, or it's boring or something like that. Well, that's true, but that should have been true for the other hand too. And so it's only when that faulty intuition is present that we see people deviating from the table. And so I think that all three criteria, again, are hit by Blackjack. And I think maybe a little bit more convincingly, another nice feature of this study is because we asked for intuitions continuously in that first round, we can look to see how that predicts their decisions. And indeed, the stronger that intuition is, the more wrong you were, the more you thought you should, hit, then the more likely you were to hit, even after having identified that the rational thing to do is to stick. We ran a follow-up where we tried to manipulate stakes to make them low or high. I know this is not a very big manipulation of stakes compared to what some people will do in the field, but for M-Turkers, winning 5 cents versus $1.95 is pretty meaningful. And what we found is that if anything, when the stakes went up, they were more likely to ignore the table. And so it wasn't a statistically a significant effect there, but I just want to note that because I think the question is always rolling around in people's minds, well, what if you increase the stakes? And here, at least at this range, it doesn't seem to help. If anything, people are more likely to follow their faulty intuition. I'm going to skip study 7 for the sake of time. It's very similar to Blackjack, except we're going to use football fans thinking about the decision to punt or go for it on 4th down, and they're exposed to the New York Times bot that tells them the actual probabilities for their different situations. I can't say anything about how common acquiescence is in the real world based on this data, but I do think it's worth thinking about sort of conditional on having a conflict between a faulty intuition and your rational knowledge. How common is it for participants in these studies to acquiesce to the faulty intuition, and how common is it for them to correct and go with what they say they rationally know to be true? And so I'm going back to the ratio bias here. Remember, lots of people didn't have the faulty intuition. Other people didn't know what was rational. So among the people who experienced the conflict as intended, we see about 1/3 acquiescing and 2/3 correcting. I'll just kind of quickly go through each of these. With envelopes, you see it's 50-50. We had more luck creating the conflict for Blackjack, and here we see 39% acquiescence, 61% correction. On football, which I didn't show you, is pretty close as well. And so again, we can't say how often it's happening in the real world, how often are people having this conflict, but when we know they're having the conflict, we see rates from about 1/3 to 1/2 in terms of people acquiescing or not. And so to briefly summarize, I am trying to convince you that superstitions and magical intuitions are widespread. They build on general purpose heuristics and they can occur automatically. But that beyond anecdotes and suggestive studies, I'm trying to suggest that we now have evidence that people will stick with intuitions that they recognize in the moment are irrational. I think this requires that our dual process accounts be modified. I also think, trying to translate it into sort of more econ speak, we can think about expanding what we mean by bounded rationality. So bounded rationality is usually thought about in terms of people's capacity, what information they have and their capacity to effectively sort of sort through that information. And here we're seeing what looks more like intentional irrationality, right? They know, they're telling you what is rational, and yet they are not following that. And I've suggested that if we decouple error detection and correction, that may help us provide a model for this behavior. So let's see, with future directions, I think I just put 2 thoughts that I thought might relate to what people here would be thinking about. So one is just the question of what makes acquiescence more or less likely. So I think it's worth considering what makes an intuition particularly compelling so that it's sticky. And also, right, that's the kind of impelling force, but also the constraining force, what allows people to set aside what they know to be true. And one thing that I think may be important is the distinction between knowing that something is true and knowing why something is true. And so even across our studies, you may have noticed that sometimes that rational knowledge would be something that's kind of just given to you, and sometimes it's something that people may actually understand and get there on their own. And that may be an important distinction to consider. Finally, this point about detection and correction being separated. If we can if we can pinpoint where things are going wrong, whether it's a failure to detect or a failure to correct, I think it may suggest other interventions than ones that we typically work with. We might want to move beyond, for example, an information deficit model. That really points to a failure to detect, but it may be the case that people recognize their errors and still aren't changing their behavior. And in that case, rather than thinking about trying to provide that rational information, what may end up being more effective is trying to undermine where that intuition is coming from in the first place. And perhaps that would be a more effective tool for changing these faulty intuitions and changing the behaviors that are resulting from them. And so that's where I'm going to end without any interruptions. It ended up being almost exactly perfectly timed, but now I'm very happy to take any questions or suggestions or any reactions.
Perhaps, so Andreas had asked a question in the chat, which I don't know if he wants to, I'll just go ahead and read for now. So he was asking about whether this applies to religion as well, or whether we should think of religious magical thinking as something different because it's more sustained by institutions.
I think that's a great question, and already in the question itself, you can see sort of where it's distinct, why it might be different. So I think we could certainly take this and apply it to religion to think about situations like when atheists are behaving as if they believe in God. And that happens. And so you might think that there is an underlying intuition about God, even for people who claim to be an atheist. So I think we can apply it, but just as the question suggests, I am reluctant to put religion right into this case. So some scholars will say that all of this sort of supernatural belief, paranormal belief, magical thinking, superstition should all be put together. I'm a little bit reluctant to do so for almost exactly the reasons that were described. And also magical thinking and superstition are more focused on causal claims, which is why this work has been sort of tied more to that. But I do think that it can apply to other cases, and religion is a really nice example of that.
Marcel?
Yes, you ended the presentation about by saying, what could lead people to, follow this acquiescence model. So I thought regret aversion, I thought would be one possibility. So basically, when you have the lottery number and why wouldn't you want to exchange this lottery number for another one? You think, well, what happens now if this lottery number wins? I'm going to curse myself for exchanging it. The same thing with the envelopes. The same thing. So that applies to, a lot of not all of them, not the blackjack example, I think, but some of them. And of course, whether you blame yourself, whether you curse yourself, may be partially framed by social expectations and the social environment. So, what will people think of me if I do this? And it could sometimes induce you to take risk, and sometimes induce you to avoid even small risks.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, there was a lot there. So first of all, I fully agree that anticipation of regret can play a role in this. And particularly, I think the reluctance to exchange lottery ticket has been thought about through that lens. That's why I mentioned this follow-up study with the envelopes that we did for somebody else, because people are still reporting this faulty intuition if somebody else exchanged their ticket, which wouldn't be your own regret. Now, you could still imagine a model where it's just a simulation of what your emotional experience would be. So I'm not going to try to rule it out entirely. But I will say that we're capturing faulty intuitions even when it's not just you. But to your broader point, I think emotion that is attached to intuition is going to play a very powerful role in which intuitions are very compelling and which ones are not. So when I had the criteria there for you, I didn't include anything about emotion because I don't think of emotion as being either necessary or sufficient for identifying acquiescence. But I fully agree that to the extent that not following your intuition is going to have emotional consequences, then that's a cost that's getting weighed against the costs of not being rational in that particular situation. So I think those feelings, those emotions may be a really important part of why intuitions are followed. But in terms of me defining it, I want to make sure that there is actually a faulty intuition, not just an emotional reaction to the situation.
I believe Travis Libert asked a question in the chat. I don't know if can unmute himself, or I'll read. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. So two quick clarifying questions. One is, how does this relate to the illusion of control that's also been studied with lottery and lottery tickets? And then the second is, I'm curious your thoughts about kind of the role that path dependency might play here. It seems like if I've adhered to a particular intuition in the past, then abandoning it in the present actually can impose a certain cognitive dissonance cost in itself, right? So it seems like there's sort of a sunk cost fallacy maybe in play, that we want to be consistent over time, and maybe we're sort of resistant to abandoning an intuition on that basis.
Yeah, okay, so let me take the second one first because I remember it. Is there a path dependence? I think there could. I think there could be. And so when we think about what makes intuitions compelling, having followed them before may be part of that. And certainly whether other people around you are doing it I think would play a role too. Interestingly, in these studies, because before we measure behavior, we ask them for their intuition and for their rational knowledge. And we are getting divergence. So people are willing to report that they have a faulty intuition that is not rational. And so I agree that path dependence may matter, but it's not so strong where they can't answer those questions differently. I mean, it may be why we're not getting as extreme differences as we could if there was somehow we could ask them without having them sort of attend to the different questions. But I don't think, so I think the path dependence could matter, but it does seem like people are willing to switch between these two ways of thinking as well. And your first question was about control. So certainly control has been thought about in terms of the superstition and magical thinking literature, largely this sort of motivational idea that maybe it's just that I just need to act. I just need to do something if I'm in a difficult situation. And I think that can help explain a lot of magical behavior, but it's not as clear sort of in the example of when people don't act, when they avoid doing something because of a magical fear. That doesn't feel like I'm actively taking control. And also, it doesn't explain the underlying intuitions that we seem to track in terms of, let's think of a good example. Okay, so if I engage in a jinx, you may say, well, knocking on wood is just a way to feel like I have any control. But we also find that when people jinx themselves, they tell you that the bad outcome is more likely. And so it seems like there is something underlying the behavior, and it can't, I would be resistant to say that it's only about control. But I do think that control certainly plays an important role, an important part of magical thinking more broadly.
Frank?
Hi. I thought this is really cool. I was wondering about high stakes behaviors or situations, and on the one hand, you might think that when stakes are really high, some of the sort of more deliberate thinking might sort of make some of these things, beliefs go away. And I'm sort of wondering whether that's in fact true or whether you would predict that. And then second, I guess there's another way in which it could matter for high stakes behaviors. There's lots of people for whom the stakes are not that high, but jointly they believe some crazy stuff that could lead to really bad consequences for society or whatever, even though maybe each single person's beliefs or behavior is not that consequential on their own. So I don't know how you think about both of these actually.
So to the first point, I think it's a wonderful question, and it's important I think, to separate the idea of stakes from the idea of putting more of a cost on ignoring rationality, because those aren't always the same. So I think, just as you said, the idea sort of, for example, if you imagine sports fans, stakes go up in the playoffs and superstition is going to go up in the playoffs too. It's not that it's going to go away when it gets more important. I also think that some of these studies are nice because my hope is that when you increase the stakes, you don't only increase the cost of the rational, of ignoring rationality, but you may also increase the cost of ignoring intuition. I hope I'm not taking too much time in sharing this story, but it was so amusing to me. My grad student, the blackjack data came in while I was on a vacation with my in-laws. And, my husband was like, tell them, they'll want to hear what it is. And so I described the study, and my mother-in-law, who's a chemistry professor, incredibly rational, but she says, of course you're going to stick with that original envelope. And my father-in-law could not get past that because he kept complaining to me. He says, $5, sure, okay, but what if you really made it more? And he's like, what if it was $1,000? And she just kept saying, if it's $1,000, you even more have to be convinced to stick with your original one, right? That the intuition that it's bad to exchange also goes up in that moment. And so if the costs are only going up for ignoring rationality, then I think, of course, we'll see less acquiescence. But stakes that could increase both, it's a lot less clear. And so that blackjack study I showed was really minor stakes, but at least with that variation, we didn't see it going away. To your second point about the social nature, right? So even if the cost for one person, not so much, but once it's aggregated, it becomes bigger. I actually think that that economists have thought about some of the social parts of magical thinking and superstitions even more than psychologists have, to think about how in a group, if a magical belief may be irrational for an individual person, but if the group holds this irrational belief, it will actually get us to engage in behaviors as a collective that will be better for the collective. And so I do think that that's important. I also think that just the idea that once other people entertain something as a possibility, that can spark that intuition, right? That's, even if I wouldn't have considered it, as soon as I know that other people are considering it, well, then it's on the table. And entertaining this possibility can be enough to create that intuition. And so I think the social part of this is understudied, and certainly by psychologists understudied compared to what we could know about the social cost. So it's both about, again, the other people sort of informing the belief and creating that intuition, and then also the costs that come from following intuition or rationality should vary based on what other people around you believe and what's expected in that situation.
Casey, and I think this will probably be our last question, but we'll see.
Oh no, Frank asked my question, so I'm good.
Oh. Okay, Garance?
Yes. Sorry if I missed that, but if you ask people to pay a little bit, that is, you bring all the superstition, changing the envelope. But what if people have to pay a little bit to keep their superstition? That is, keep on the same dimension, monetary. And now I have to pay a little bit in order to engage into my fantasy.
It's a wonderful question. We haven't run it that way. There are studies in the literature that suggest that might change things. Certainly compared to not having any cost, it's harder to say compared to the way that I introduce the cost. But in fact, even what some research has found, that even just getting people to think about the financial sort of incentives or think about it even just on a financial metric can engage that system to processing. So for example, when people are asked something like, would you be willing to wear this sweater that was worn by a murderer? That's been dry cleaned and whatnot, but people don't want to do it. If you ask them in terms of their affective response, how are you willing to do this? Like how comfortable or uncomfortable you would be. Almost everybody tells you that they'd be uncomfortable doing this. They don't want to do it. But then if you ask them, how much would you pay to not have to do it? You'll see almost nobody willing to pay anything. And so I know, there's different ways to interpret this. It's possible that really people were telling you, that wasn't really their belief. They only kind of thought it, but as soon as, the rubber hits the road, when money's involved, they're not going to do it. They're actually really indifferent. So that would not be my interpretation, but it could be an interpretation. My interpretation is that it's easy when you ask people on an affective scale, you're going to get them telling you their intuitions. And when you flip that onto a more sort of monetary scale, people are going to engage system 2 more than they otherwise would. And so from my point of view, I wouldn't say that that intuition isn't there, but that you've gotten people to correct. And so now if they do that, then I wouldn't claim acquiescence there, right? But I'm just thinking sort of more broadly in the magical thinking literature. But I think it would be interesting to see, could we get acquiescence, not because we've attached a cost to following your intuition, or like a probable cost, but specifically by making people pay. I think it would be an interesting thing to try, and I haven't done that yet.
Thank you.
Well, I think we're out of time there, but thank you so much, Jane, for that awesome talk. That was really great.